There's a version of a man that most women never get to see. He's the one quietly doing all the emotional heavy lifting. He's texting back instantly. He's rearranging his weekend because she seemed a little off. He's rehearsing in his head how to bring something up without making her feel bad. He lies awake running calculations, whether he said too much or not enough, whether the problem is her or whether it's him, and that version is exhausted. And at some point, not dramatically, not with a speech and not even necessarily with a conversation, something in him shifts. He stops. And it's not because he became cold or he checked out or he's given up on his relationships, but it's because he's finally understood something that nobody had ever put into words for him. That a man who doesn't respect himself cannot be respected by anyone else. All the softening, the accommodating, the making himself smaller, that's not love. That was a slow erosion of everything that made him worth being with in the first place. This is a video about that moment. The moment that a man finally chooses himself. What it looks like, what it means, and why. And this is the part that surprises people the most. It is one of the most attractive things a man can do. I'm going to give you the signs, not to judge the men who are still in this exhausted place, but to help you recognize, whether you're a man watching this or a woman who loves one, what it actually looks like when a man reclaims himself, because it doesn't look like what you think it does. Now, before we get into the signs, there's something that I want to say, because without this, the whole video might be misread. A man choosing himself is not a man becoming selfish. It's not a man becoming unavailable, cold, or emotionally shut down. Those things are not self-respect, they're self-protection, and they're very different things. Self-protection is a wall, self-respect is a standard, and a man who genuinely found his self-respect is not harder to reach, he's actually just clearer to read. He's more grounded, he's more direct, he's more present, he knows what he wants and he says it, and he knows what he won't accept and he holds it. Not with anger, not with threats, but with a calm, settled certainty that's almost impossible to fake. That's what you're learning to recognize today. The first sign is he stops explaining himself to people who aren't listening. There is a particular kind of emotional labor that men in low self-respect patterns know intimately. It's the endless explaining, the justifying, the over-communication of reasons, feelings, decisions to someone who's going to dismiss them or weaponize them anyway. A man who's found his self-respect, he stops doing this. And it's not because he becomes secretive or he stops communicating, but it's because he's finally understood that explanation is not the same as connection, and that clarity doesn't require someone else's approval to be valid. Watch for this one carefully, because it looks different depending on who you are. If you're used to a man who's over-explained, his silence might start to feel like withdrawal. It's not withdrawal, it's the absence of anxiety. He's not pulling away from you, he's no longer being pulled around by the need for your validation. When a man stops over-explaining, he just stops treating other people's opinions as the final word on who he is. Sign number 2, he lets things end without chasing. This is one of the most significant and most misread signs there is. A man who doesn't yet have his self-respect, he's going to chase. He's going to send the follow-up text after the silence. He'll reach back out after the fade. He'll find a reason to reopen something, to try it one more time, because the comfort of unresolved ending feels much worse than the discomfort of staying in something that just isn't working. The moment that he stops chasing is not the moment he stopped caring. It's the moment that he understood something that took him a really long time to learn, that his presence is not something to beg for someone to receive. Research in the psychology of attachment, including work by Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver on adult attachment patterns, shows that anxious behaviors like over-pursuing and the inability to tolerate endings are not signs of love. They're signs of a dysregulated nervous system trying to relieve its own anxiety. So what looks like devotion from the outside is actually fear on the inside. When a man stops chasing and lets things end clearly, his nervous system has learned something new. He's learned that he'll be okay. He doesn't need to close every loop, and that some endings are not failures, they're just answers. He lets it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because he knows his own worth enough to know that staying where he isn't chosen is the one thing that he can no longer do. Sign 3, he starts saying no without an apology attached. Pay close attention to this one because it's subtle. A man who's still earning his place in his relationship, in a friendship or a workplace, anywhere, will say no with a cushion around it. He'll soften it, explain it, justify it. He'll offer an alternative just to make sure the other person isn't upset. The no itself is almost secondary to the effort that he puts into managing their reaction to it. A man who's found his self-respect says no differently. It's clean. It doesn't come with an hour of hedging. He's not rude about it. Self-respect is not rudeness, but he is clear about it without the apology attached to what is actually a reasonable boundary. The shift is psychologically enormous because saying no without apologizing for it requires a specific belief that your needs and your limits are as valid as anyone else's. For men who spent years operating as if the goal was to be as agreeable and as low maintenance as possible, that belief is a revolution. When you hear a man say no and mean it without the performance of guilt around it, you're watching a man who's finally stopped treating his own limits as inconveniences to be managed. Sign 4, he stops shrinking in rooms that made him feel small. This one's a little bit harder to put into words, but you'll know it immediately when you see it. There are rooms and relationships where certain men become less. They get quieter, their opinions disappear, they agree with things that they don't actually agree with, they laugh at things that aren't funny to them, they present a version of themselves calibrated to be accepted rather than actually be seen. It isn't dishonesty exactly, it's armor. It's the learned behavior of a man who has experienced, probably more than once, that being fully himself in certain spaces was not safe or welcome. The day that a man chooses himself, those rooms lose their power over him. He doesn't walk in looking for a fight. He doesn't announce that he's changed. He just simply stops performing. He takes up the space that he's entitled to and he says the things he actually thinks. And if the room doesn't like it, he watches with something close to curiosity instead of panic. Amy Cuddy's research on embodied cognition at Harvard found that body posture and physical presence aren't just signals of confidence, they actually generate it. When a man stops physically shrinking in space, his internal state begins to shift as well. Posture changes psychology. Self-respect often starts in the body before it starts in the mind. Sign 5, he becomes comfortable with people being disappointed in him. This is the one that changes everything. The deepest reason that men lose their self-respect is not that they're weak, it's just that they can't tolerate disapproval. The fear of someone being disappointed or so angry with them is so activating to their nervous system that they'll do almost anything to prevent it. They'll agree to things that they don't want to. They'll stay in situations that they know are not right. They'll twist themselves into positions that hurt them as long as it keeps the peace. Now, when a man finally chooses himself, that changes. And it's not because he stops caring about other people's feelings, he still does. But it's because he's finally separated two things in his brain that he used to treat the same. Someone being disappointed in him and him being wrong. They are not the same thing. A person can be disappointed in you and you can still be right. Someone can be angry with you and you can still have acted with integrity. The discomfort of disapproval is not evidence that you've done something wrong. It's just discomfort. And when a man internalizes this, like really internalizes it, not just intellectually but in his body, his decisions become cleaner. His relationships start to become more honest and he stops making choices that are driven by avoiding a reaction and starts making choices driven by his own values. That's the moment that he stops being manageable and starts just being a real person. Sign 6, he knows what he wants and he says it. A man without self-respect is genuinely unsure of what he wants because he spent so long figuring out what he's supposed to want, what she wants, what the situation seems to require, that his own desires have gone quiet from years of not being consulted. A man who's chosen himself, he gets loud again. Not loud in the room, quite the opposite actually, but loud internally. He knows what kind of relationship he wants. He knows what kind of treatment is acceptable to him and what isn't. And he knows what he's building towards and what he's no longer willing to compromise on. And crucially, he says it early, directly, and without wondering if it's going to scare someone off. Because here's the thing about a man who knows what he wants and says it clearly. It's the single most attractive quality a man can have. Not because it's dominant or aggressive, but because clarity is extraordinarily rare. Most people are running a guessing game. They're trying to decode what the other person's really after. But a man who simply tells you calmly, without pressure, what he's looking for is doing something that almost nobody does. He's treating you like an adult who deserves honest information. And that is not a small thing. Sign 7, he stops being available to everyone all of the time. A man who's still earning his place makes himself very available. He answers quickly. He rearranges his schedule. He overgives his time, his attention, and his energy because some part of him believes that if he stops giving, he'll stop being wanted. When a man finds his self-respect, his availability changes. And it's not because he becomes unavailable, but it's because his time becomes something that he actually values. He has his own things, his work, his friendships, his goals, the version of himself that he's in the middle of building. Those are things that are real to him now. They're not things that he abandons the moment that someone more interesting shows up. This is one of the most counterintuitive truths in the psychology of attraction. The man who's always available is the least attractive version of himself. And it's not because he's playing hard to get as a strategy, but it's because constant availability signals that nothing else in his life is more compelling than whoever is right in front of him now. That's not magnetism, that's need. A man with self-respect has a life that he's genuinely reluctant to interrupt. And that right there is magnetic. Sign 8, he stops trying to fix what isn't his to fix. This is one of the quieter signs, but it's one of the deepest. A lot of men in low self-respect patterns are fixers. Not in the healthy, loving sense, but in the compulsive sense. They find women who are going through something and they pour themselves into solving it. They're drawn to situations where being needed is the closest thing to being wanted that they've ever felt. Now, for a while, sometimes for years, they mistake being needed for being valued. They confuse emotional labor with love. The day a man chooses himself, he starts to see the difference. He notices when he's being called on because he's genuinely loved, and when he's being called on because he's useful. He notices when a dynamic is mutual and when he's carrying everything alone. He starts to withdraw from the dynamics that were using him without honoring him. Not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that's new. He stops trying to fix people who haven't asked to be fixed. He stops signing up for emotional debt that was never going to be repaid. He learns, and this takes real maturity, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is not to rescue them. Sign 9, he can be all alone without it meaning something's wrong. This one is perhaps the clearest sign of all. A man who doesn't respect himself cannot be alone comfortably. Solitude feels like a verdict to him. It feels like evidence that he isn't enough and that if he were, someone would be there. So he fills the silence with noise, with people, with anything that keeps him from sitting inside the feeling that he is fundamentally insufficient. The man who's chosen himself, he's learned to sit in his own company and find it good. Not perfect or painless, but genuinely okay. He doesn't treat Quiet Friday night as a failure. He doesn't need to perform having plans. He's become, perhaps for the first time, someone he actually likes spending time with. Research on self-concept and identity consistency consistently shows us that people who are comfortable alone have a stronger, more stable sense of who they are. They don't need constant external input to confirm their value. They carry that sense of value with them. When a man is comfortable alone, he's not lonely. He's whole. And that wholeness is something that can be felt by everyone around him. Sign 10, he stops performing and just starts being. This is where it all comes together. Everything above, the clean no, the comfortable solitude, the dropped apologies, the space he takes up in a room, all of it is an expression of one underlying shift. He stops performing a version of himself that's designed to be chosen, and he just starts being the person he actually is, with no editing, no audience management, no calculation about whether this version of him will be approved. And here's the thing that's almost paradoxical. The moment that a man stops trying to be attractive, he stops auditioning, he stops managing your impression of him, is almost always the moment that he becomes most attractive. Because what you're feeling in his presence is no longer the performance, it's the person. And a person fully and honestly present is one of the most rare, compelling things that another human being on the planet can encounter. That settled, unhurried, unperforming quality, that is what women describe when they talk about a man who just had something about him. It's not the jawline, it's not the confidence trick, it's the absence of need. It's the presence of self, the sense that this man knows who he is, and that knowledge is entirely independent of whether you agree with him or not. So here's where I want to land. If you're a man who's watching this and you recognize yourself in some of those earlier signs, so the chasing, the over-explaining, the shrinking, I want you to hear something clearly. There is no shame in it. None. What you were doing was responding to what you had learned about how to be safe and loved in the world. But you can learn something new. And if you're a woman watching this and someone in your life is going through this shift, a man who's becoming quieter, cleaner, less available, more himself, I want you to understand what you might actually be witnessing. It's not someone pulling away necessarily. It might be someone coming home to himself. The man who chooses himself is not the man who stops caring about love. He's the man who finally understands that he has to be someone fully before he can give that to someone else. His boundaries are his backbone, his standards are his signal, and his self-respect is the most magnetic thing about him. If this video resonated with you, take a look at my course, Magnetic Masculine, where we dive deeply into this subject and so much more. There's a link in the description below. Thank you for watching.